And for the new Dualistic Unity Raw segment that we do on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That is the time that we are now doing them. If you can join us and it's a Thursday and it's 4 p.m. Eastern Time, definitely do, because we're going to be doing this from now on. It is a shorter episode, though. This is only going to be an hour, and so we're going to get right into some interesting shit. Andrew and I, of course, have been talking about the deeper end of existence and the path of not having a path, as it were. It started with this morning's Instagram live stream, and then it went into the Patreon call, where we dipped in and out of the deeper end of the conversation, because of course you can't stay there forever. There is a lot of context to process. And so I'm going to pass it over to Andrew while I set up our YouTube live, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, yeah, it's been an interesting afternoon yesterday slash morning and midday. I've been pretty baked for the last, I don't know, 18, 20 hours, and it has a totally different feel to it right now. It's like yesterday I had my pen, but I also had a joint and I smoked a bunch, like a lot. And I was like, because I haven't, and of course there's going to be a point where I'm like, oh, this is a lot, but I feel like I can push that bound a lot further than I used to be able to. Like I was sitting, even this morning, I woke up and smoked a decent amount and went to a coffee shop and did some work for a few hours. And I was like really, really high in there. But there was no concern for it, because it very much has felt very dreamlike since, and realizing just the sensitivity and the being in it versus not being in it. There's, like Ray said earlier today, you have to let go of the need to find out what it's all about, because it's like anything in regards to that, like anything that you're doing as something divided from everything else, as opposed to just being everything that's happening, pulls you out of it. Like when you're sitting in yourself, recognizing yourself, interacting with yourself, just moving through yourself, as soon as you're something in that experience, like you're not in it in the same way anymore, but that tug is always there. You know, you get a glance from someone, that's you looking at yourself, that's you recognizing yourself. And then as soon as you make an assumption about what that glance means, it's just a neutral glance. But if you're insecure, you're like, oh, it means this, oh, it means that, and that false certainty comes in. All of a sudden you're not in it. You're back to being the conceptual idea of you. Or someone glances and you're like, oh, they must like me. It's like, even that, it's either end of the spectrum. Any assumption that we settle upon pulls us out of it. And we're always making assumptions. And it's always just us interacting with ourselves, looking at ourselves. So all of our experiences and our perception of our value is rooted in our perception of ourself. It doesn't come from anywhere else. It's always an assumption, like I am either this much valuable or this little valuable, and it's coming from you. And you're just using everyone and everything else that you perceive that's still you as an excuse to validate that assumption. But the assumption is inherently incorrect. It can never possibly be correct. So we're always just settling upon these assumptions that aren't correct, creating our own measurement that doesn't exist in fucking reality. And as soon as anything, the slightest thing, means something one way or another, settling upon an assumption of an interaction of how something's going, you're not in it anymore. But it's like, it's trippy to be like teeter back and forth on that. And like, I feel like the last time it happened was, it's like either before or after our last retreat, when I was with Ray, and throughout the retreat to varying degrees. And it's always happening on varying degrees. It's whether or not we're paying attention to it, I guess. But it's like that, that fine line between the recognition and settling upon any assumption whatsoever.
Absolutely. Well, this is the point of meditation, right? It is to allow yourself to sit within the cycling thoughts until you can find the gap that happens before you attach to them, right? Like, it's being able to feel with a certain degree of sensitivity the silence before you act, right? Because otherwise, as we've said, as you're getting pushed and pulled and whatnot, it's all reaction, right? It's all reaction to whatever it is that's happening, whether it's the carrot or the stick or whatever it is. But to get to a point where everything is action, is to get to a point of responsibility and ultimately awareness that everything is your action, right? Because that is the responsibility. But see, meditation will take you there to a certain degree, but it won't go the distance. Like what I mean is that meditation itself will help you quiet the thoughts and find the gap, but it doesn't mean that you're going to understand what that gap is. It doesn't mean you're going to question who you think you are. You'll just come to a better relationship with your thoughts, which is a different experience. Still beneficial. Sometimes that's all we want, is to get to a place where we have a better relationship with our thoughts. So we can go back to the world of the living and pay our taxes and have a job without freaking out and get into relationships and go dating and do all that other stuff, right? With less toxicity. But that doesn't mean that you're ever going to question who you think you are. It just means you'll have a better relationship with the thoughts about who you think you are. But you can go deeper. You can go even question who you think you are. You can question what everything is. And then all of a sudden you find yourself awash of even more thoughts that now you have to find a way to have a better relationship with. And that's ultimately what it is: widening your context, widening your perspective, expanding your awareness, expanding whatever it is you think you are until there are no walls whatsoever. But if there are no walls, that means that everything that could be is within it. And you have to learn how to dance with that without losing balance.
It's like there's a shift with the thoughts from recognizing that they don't have anything to do with you to recognizing that they couldn't have anything to do with you. And there's like that sort of like passive falling away of the potential of them meaning something, as opposed to thinking that there could still be something. And like, it's just the varying levels of assumptions that we're willing to make dictates that experience to a degree, like where I'm willing to settle, not out of certainty, but out of discomfort. And it's like the depth to that and like the functionality of the experience, but that could also just be an excuse, like saying, I have to settle upon this. Like, can you not settle upon it? Like, can you play the role without settling upon it? And yeah, like there's every time you play the part or play the role, there's like a tiny little twang of a investment in it almost, and the potential to get sucked into that is always there. But it's just how sensitive you are and how much you're paying attention to the experience, like how much you are where you're at. Because anytime it means something about you, it doesn't mean something about you here and now. It means something about a conceptual idea that exists in potential. Like all that idea is potential that can't actually be settled upon ever. It's just always this sort of translucent thing, like a ghost or a mirage that we believe to be the truth. And can you look at it and recognize that it's a mirage and still continue to look at it? Or do you look at it and get confused into thinking it's not a mirage? Because then you have to get rid of it. And I think that's the side of the non-duality thing, thinking that it isn't a mirage. And so therefore you don't want to be it. And so there's like a denial, like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a denial of the experience of me because you think that there's some validity to that division. And so you just toss all of it out, including your experience, basically. And that's why they all look so numb and dull and like fucking there's no life in there, because they've thrown it out with their desire to not have an experience of me being here now. It's still you here now. It's just not the conceptual idea. It's always you here now, as me, as Ray, as anyone you interact with. So there, it's always you. It's just your perspective of what that fucking means.
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of like method actors, right? Like, could you imagine being a method actor, getting so lost in your character that you can't come out of it? And that's what happens, right? This is the great insight. At the end of the day, it's like, oh wait, if I'm always acting as a certain character, am I acting as a certain character right now? This is what Jim Carrey had expressed, and what's been expressed by a great many actors over time, especially actors who had such a problem getting out of character that they actually suffered in terms of mental illness after the fact, right? Like the little girl who was in The Exorcist, for example. After filming that, yeah, she got fucked up pretty good after that, and then of course she did. Like, that movie's messed right up, and somebody that age, especially back then, I mean, you got to consider it's different now. There's so much more in terms of like exposure to horror movies and gore and all this freaky stuff. It's kind of like the arrival of Family Guy. Family Guy was almost necessary as the next step in shock humor at the time, right? It was like, there was some kind of shock humor in The Simpsons, of Futurama, and then Family Guy just stepped in and went, we can top that. And all of a sudden that became the next level of appropriate, right? Now everything's trying to top that, right? So same with horror movies. But back in the day, like The Exorcist was a big deal. Like, it was a big deal. It's kind of like I was saying to somebody the other day, like when The Matrix came out, people committed suicide. Like, we don't remember that, but there were people who committed suicide after watching The Matrix.
Just like recognizing the reality of their situation.
The fear that they are actually in the Matrix, that they have no control, that there's these robot overlords that are basically controlling all of us. Like, it's not that different from simulation theory, if you think about it, right? Except it's got a way darker overtone.
Seriously. Because, yeah, I mean, that shift, that progression of getting, scarier and scarier movies, more and more real feeling things, like kind of goes along in connection with our desire to not be here now, like our desire to escape where we're at. The more we build conceptual ideas that mean anything, and like the need, because even the positive idea of yourself, if you're here now and you're a little uncomfortable, just think about that. Just think about that nice shiny idea that I've maintained. And so it goes either direction. It's just escaping where you're at and allowing you to not pay attention to where you're at, allowing you to not be sensitive to the experience, allowing you to miss your fucking life. Like, it literally is allowing you to miss your fucking life. All of the ideas that we maintain, any conceptual idea of ourself, it's like we're in it to be something, to become something or become nothing, as opposed to just being it, like already being it. Like, what is and it's crazy to see both sides of it, and the fear and the desire side of it. And either one is rooted in lack. Even if you say that it's not, even if you're like, oh, I don't feel lack, but I want to get here. It's like, why? Why are you prioritizing getting there over being where you're at, over life here and now? Like, if that's not your ultimate priority, that experience, then you are perceiving lack because you think there is a spot you can get to in order to build up that lack, in order to meet that 100% capacity of worthiness or whatever, as opposed to recognizing that you're already at that point all the fucking time. There's no way for it to fluctuate. It's always there, but we buy into the idea that it could go up, that there's the potential for it to go up or for it to go down. It's on either side, and they're both incorrect, and they're both just rooted in assumptions of what we think we are. The illusion of what we think we are is, God, it's so powerful, but it's always a fucking assumption, illusion rooted in an assumption.
Yeah, well, absolutely, because the reality is ripples, right? Like, the reality is that we're always making ripples, and that the world that we're currently existing in is largely the result of the quality of the ripples, or rather, I think a better way of saying that would be the depth of the ripples. Like we have a really chaotic pond, but the ripples aren't that deep, right? It's just all chaos. Whereas being in the moment, accepting you are the moment, getting out of your way, developing that sensitivity deeper and deeper and deeper, regardless of the discomfort that goes with the stillness that we're talking about, changes everything that you do, which means it changes every ripple. And as we've talked about in the Patreon groups and the episodes and so on and so forth, when you go up to somebody and instead of just going, hey, how's it going? Oh, good. Yeah, me too, man. Did you hear about that? And then you just go on with your day trying to get somewhere. You actually go, how are you? And you stop and you listen. And in that moment of listening, you have an actual conversation where that person has a different experience than they would have otherwise. You've interrupted their flow as well, giving them the opportunity to recognize that slowing down isn't necessarily the bad thing that they've convinced themselves it is because they got shit to do, right? And there's an opportunity there that wasn't there before. And then maybe that person carries it on later on that day. But imagine how many different ripples you would make in a single day, depending on how deep you really took this in. Right. And that's really it. How deep can you take it in? And what ripples does it make? And this is, again, why dualistic unity continues to blow my mind.
Yeah, I really like that that recognition of the need, the perception of need, of needing to get somewhere. And like we were talking about on Patreon, kind of along the lines of what you brought up, like the speed at which we get there determines our value. Like that, and it's need for anything. Need for, did I glitch there? No. Okay. Need for anything. It's our need for validation from other people, need for other people to like us, need to be loved, need for new stuff, need for the new thing, need for the big house, all of that. And so immediately you're put on this sort of timeline trajectory, or just, you're in a fucking arena or on a racetrack. And the quicker you get to that point, the more value you have, or even you don't have value until it happens. It's like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, now I'm good. And then it kind of like falls by the wayside and you're like, oh, it's dwindling. Oh, because it's like you're going through it and it's like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Get it. And it's only relative. If you get a big house or something, say that's your ultimate goal, get a big house, X amount of square feet. And then, so no value, no value, no value. And then all the value, because it's relative, because a big house is a relative idea. And so then you're at 100%, because you look around, you're like, oh yeah, I have a relatively bigger house than everyone. But all of a sudden, you're in that house. Some of your friends start getting a bigger house. As their house is bigger now, relatively, you don't have a very big house anymore. And because, having that house was 100%, as that relative bigger houses, your percent starts to drop and diminish. And as the fucking shininess of that gets rubbed away, it's like the more you sink into, all of a sudden, all of your friends, 30 of your friends have slightly bigger houses. And so now your value is back to zero. And it's just this like, and that's obviously just an example, but it's like this process of nothing to something, and then that dwindling, and then needing the next thing. And it's all relative. It's all in comparison to everyone else. There is no objective thing that's like, this is solving it, outside of recognizing that you're already it, because you recognize more clearly the reality of what you are. You're not living based on this fictitious idea that can have value that fluctuates whatsoever. So that's what I was saying before. It's not even an option anymore for it to, the potential for it to fluctuate. It's not the option to be liked or disliked or validated by anyone else, because there is no one else. It's always just you coming back to yourself, interacting with yourself. All of our assumptions of what other people are doing are our own perspectives being projected and using other people as an excuse. Someone can give someone a blank look and they're going to perceive it however they perceive themselves. If I look at you with just no thoughts whatsoever, you're going to create an idea of the reason that I'm looking at you, what I think about you, and people can create an entire story, and it's all based on assumption. It's all you. It's all you, because it is you. interacting with yourself. And we just make these assumptions, buy into these assumptions, invest in these assumptions that fuck us up because they're not actually reality, because we've made assumptions about reality as opposed to being attentive to reality. And it's always just you interacting with yourself.
Yeah. We're going to take a short moment here because this is a live stream and we have people participating in the comment section. Want to say hi to everyone. Thank you for being here. I see a couple of people from Patreon. We have a question. What do you guys think about contradictions? Is there anything that isn't a contradiction in some way? The short answer is I think about contradictions all the time. They're awash in everything that's conceptual. Is there anything that's not a contradiction? What is?
Yeah, I think that's kind of it. Like everything else has the potential for contradiction because it's not what is. It's kind of getting bastardized as soon as you try and point to it or use it. Like the contradiction of pointing to what is like you're what is pointing at it. So it's not even something. Yeah, I don't have too much on contradictions. I don't know. Is there like a specific example or curiosity about a certain thing? But
yeah. Not specifically in this either. And I did notice that it came up, I think, on Instagram or TikTok, and we didn't get a chance to address it because, frankly, I wasn't sure where to go with that. But yeah, I mean, concepts are always kind of contradictory. I mean, they are by their nature incomplete, and so as soon as you look too deeply into them, they start to fall apart. It's kind of like internal and external. They don't actually work, but that's why everything's dualistic, is to create that dichotomy. So they kind of have to contradict in order to have a dichotomy. Like yin and yang, for example, while being the same thing, contradict one another because that's why they exist.
yeah, so as long as you're involved and invested in the idea of yourself, there's always going to be everything's going to be contradictory. Everything that you do is going to be contradictory and relative and in comparison to things that you're making assumptions on. And it's all just your assumptions allowing for all of those things to even happen. And so when you stop making assumptions, the contradictions fall away and you're left with what is. And like sitting in that uncertainty is what is. Like being here now without making assumptions about what any of it means about you, what any of the things that are happening, whether they're good or bad, or your opinions of it or your judgments of it, like being willing to sit in that is not contradictory because there's nothing opposing it besides an assumption or a perspective. It's just because it's the potential for any perspective that you're sitting in each and every moment. And it's kind of on you to make it and immediately exist in that dichotomy and the potential for any of those things to come up. But without those assumptions, there's not the opportunity for those to come up nearly as much. But how do we find people to actually, how are you? Was that a question?
That is a question from the comment section. But how do we find people to actually have a deep, meaningful, how are you conversation? Is it about finding people?
Good question. This is something we covered in season 5, episode 1, I believe. And yeah, we have a relationships workshop as well. But yeah, it's not okay. So like if you're willing to look at it, you get to a point where you recognize that without the assumptions, you're just interacting with iterations of you and you're experiencing you. But as soon as you make an assumption about your idea of yourself, there's the need for that to be perceived in any sort of way. And then there's the desire for, with the idea of you comes the idea of other people. And then your assumption of how they're interacting with people and the conversations that they're having. And I think there's a massive assumption going around in reality that everyone has a bunch of friends all the time to talk to with and like has a great fucking life and you don't, and you need things to be different and you need certain things. And there's like, I don't know, a lot of underlying assumptions that we make in reality about other people's lives and how they're living it. And then we measure ourselves based on that made up idea of how they're living their life that doesn't actually exist. That's just an assumption. So many of our insecurities and desires to be seen in a certain way or looked at in a certain way or where we think we should be are based on assumptions we've made about other people's lives and reality. And those aren't it either. So I keep coming back to assumptions, but like that's what we're always doing that. And that there are repercussions to making assumptions about something that isn't there, like making up assumptions to soothe a discomfort that doesn't have to be there if you're willing to look at it, because that will help you to be less uncomfortable in that state because you know that it doesn't mean anything about you, but it's just, we want that cessation of the discomfort. So we make assumptions and it's like, yeah, there's going to be fucking repercussions to that, to making assumptions. Like, of course there's going to be. And so that's what we see. Like it's all kind of layered on top of each other. And so we're talking about a point where, well, let's look at the assumptions. And I know sometimes I like want to jump into the root and be like, you've made 17 assumptions that got you to the place of, needing friends or whatnot. Like, let's look at some of the things you're assuming about you and reality and all the things you need and all of that. And obviously, there's layers to it and you're not pulling all 17 off at once, but it's a questioning of what you're settling upon that may not be true, which is literally all of your assumptions.
Including the assumption of what a deep how are you conversation is, because that's going to change from person to person to person. It's never going to be the same thing. In fact, it's not something you can control at all, rather than just open yourself up to fully, which means the best way to have a deep, meaningful how are you conversation to any depth is to actually give a shit, which means you're going to slow down and how you act is going to change because you're addressing yourself. That's when you really do give a shit. So that definitely helps there. We have more questions, and like I said, it's a shorter episode, so we're gonna just keep this a moving. Can these insights and recognitions come across to others as arrogance and insensitivity? Two-part answer on my end. Yes, especially early on when you're still sorting through the stuff and you're more or less convincing yourself that you can question everything that everybody else just kind of takes for granted. You can, in fact, just form your own conclusions about what all of this is. You don't have to just follow the pack. Out of the mentality where you are just trying to fit in, there is a period where you're going to be like, yeah, I need to show myself that I can do this. And in that case, you're not going to be very sensitive. You're probably going to piss people off. There's going to be a lot of different things that happen. But that is just on the way to understanding you don't have to prove anything to anyone. It's not about convincing anyone of anything. It's not about anything other than just you being responsible and accountable for here and now. So on that token, yes, you're going to cause more damage and burn more bridges early on, just because you need to know that you can do that. Later on, you're going to be more patient and you're going to recognize people's fragility a little bit better. And so there's going to be less of that. That said, based on their fragility, this would be part two. You're still likely going to piss them off if they're super fragile, just because there's going to come a point where you actually recognize that allowing them to be pissed off, which is the result of the mentality that they've committed to, is their best opportunity to work their way out of it. Which means that your perspective of the right thing to do changes. You start to recognize that it's the uncomfortable lessons and the uncomfortable insights that really change your life. And so you don't go running to be the good guy all the time. You recognize that sometimes positive change requires you to be perceived negatively. And so that's my two-part answer.
And if you don't have a need to be seen in a certain way, there's an ability to almost like tap into the sensitivity of that and to see where it's coming from and see where someone's getting caught up. Like when you see that, it's no longer about you doing something or you needing to be seen in a certain way. It's like Krishnamurti's quote, empathy has its own action. Like it really does. It's just seeing where they're coming from, what they're holding on to, seeing that they're you. Like that's the one that helps me shift from being, I don't know, potentially being able to more easily be perceived as an arrogant asshole to being more sensitive to the situation and not trying to get anywhere. Because when you're in the conversation, there can be, that perception of self and how you're doing, and measuring that progress can trickle in. And if you have that and this desire to, be super clear in the conversation or get this person to have a certain recognition, there's a lot of control, a lot of judgment, a lot of comparison trickling in. And then you're not going to be as sensitive to the situation itself. And the fact that you're just interacting with yourself and, you pissing this person off and getting them super riled up probably isn't the best thing for them to recognize that maybe they're not what they think. So there's like a fine line, and you're not going to know it. You're going to have to go back. You're going to have to go way too far, and then maybe not far enough where you think you could have pushed it a little bit more. And it's just stepping into it each and every time, not being so concerned for how you're going to measure up this time around. Like, oh, I hope I don't get too caught in trying to change them or whatever. It's like, be aware of that for sure, but don't, overlay the situation with like measuring that type of progress, because that's going to happen naturally by not being concerned about how you're doing or how they're doing relative to your expectation of hoping that they're going to get it or something. Because there's no way to do that. You can't take someone all the way. There has to be that, because as long as, and this is the bitch, and this is what spiritual people don't get, like, you can't take them there, because if it's you, it's not them. If it's you taking them, quote unquote, taking them anywhere, they can't recognize that it's all them because it's you taking them there. And yet these fucksticks still, and I'm kidding, I just use that word of endearment sometimes. They still, yeah, they maintain this idea of because they need the validation. And so they're willing to sacrifice the person's potential to let go of themselves by maintaining their own needs through being seen as a fucking guru or teacher. And they're fucking up the entire experience. But at the same time, that's me too, doing that. And it's just me on varying degrees of need and desire to be validated, and not recognizing the reality of what I am. And so we use different things in order to think that we're gaining value by sacrificing the recognition that they can't fluctuate.
Yeah, exactly. And I am all for the calling of snake oil salesmen fucksticks. Works for me. I'm all about it because, frankly, I can't think of a worse thing to do to someone's soul than to create disillusion with the idea that there is something more than just this shit. And that's the thing, is that they keep you wanting, they keep you looking, they keep you following, they keep you on a path that at the end of the day really makes them important. And so there's so much damage that goes with that. And that's the reason I always had such an issue with it, frankly. It is just because, it's so close to being the conversation that's so transformative, and yet it's poisoned right before it becomes transformative. So yeah, there's another question here. I'm going to deal with it quickly. I'm nervous to go to an improv show tonight because I've never been before, and the performers will probably recognize me as the quiet person who always shows up alone. That is possible, but not probable. You don't necessarily know. If you're going to an improv show, you're doing them a solid, even if they do focus on you. I mean, the fact is if you've ever tried improv, it's really difficult. You really are thinking about yourself more than anything else, just trying to do your best and get into whatever it is that you're experiencing. And so anything that you can focus on, it is like a life preserver in the middle of the ocean. You're like, sweet, I'm going to work with this. And so you're actually kind of doing them a favor if they do focus on you. I mean, as long as you don't take it personally. And the fact is you're saving somebody's life up there on stage.
It's funny that shift, and that shift is so powerful. Like the shift from measuring your progress or how you're doing or anything to recognizing that you're the entire situation. And so sometimes you sucking, freezing up, getting lost is best for you, for the situation. And so we get so caught in that. And I know that's like I don't know, I don't want to say like a bigger recognition, but it's certainly a lot, there's a lot there, I guess. I'll leave it at that. Because recognizing that your value can't swing, and like the experience that you have, how it goes, is still just your assumption of how it's going. Like you don't see the bigger picture. You don't know where anything's going. And so we're settling upon an assumption, even if we finish something and think we do a really terrible job, like we settle upon the false certainty. Oh, that went really poorly. You don't know. You don't know. And even while it's happening, you don't know how it's going. After it happens, you don't know how it went. You don't really know because you're just honing in on something that is not divided from anything else, creating a conceptual barrier of the situation, of the moment, of the experience that's taking you away from the ability to see the whole thing and recognize that there's no fucking way to even judge that in silo, because it doesn't exist in silo and you don't exist in silo. Like you're making ripples that are going to echo for eternity. That experience, that improv night will echo in eternity, and you have no fucking idea what it's going to lead to and the impacts and the trajectories of all of it. It is just raw uncertainty. You can't possibly know where it's going or what it means. And yet that makes us a little bit uncomfortable to recognize like this moment's going to echo in eternity, and I don't know the implications of it. So I'm going to settle on this. And all right, now that goes away. But then there's a massive cost on the other side of that assumption, on the other side of that settling upon the judgment of the situation or how you did or how it went or any of those things. And so when you see the just that things don't exist in silo, there isn't a way to judge it unless you're uncomfortable with the uncertainty and just want to create a barrier and then continue on with that assumption. And of course, there's going to be a cost to making that assumption about how it went. So anyway, you don't know, and you won't know, and you never will know. And if you can come to terms with that, things get less scary, but at the same time, they're still going to be scary. Like, your heart starts racing, you start sweating a bunch, like nothing wrong with that. It's just a response. And in the moment, if you're like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with this either, because thinking that there's something wrong with that is settling upon another assumption. So it's just continuing to allow it and just keep moving through it. And yeah, it's, I don't know, it gets easier, but you can't get to that spot where it's a little bit more comfortable without going through the discomfort. Like the discomfort's inevitable. So to get to the comfort, it's like you have to go through the discomfort. You can't circumvent it. And most people just get to this comfort and turn around, as opposed to realizing that there's actually less discomfort the more you keep going through the discomfort.
Nice. We're going to keep rolling. I have been wondering a lot about boundaries in relationships. I did throw a link into the chat section. We did a workshop on relationships. I highly recommend checking it out because we go into detail with this entire question. What do you guys think? Because I mean, if we are everything and nothing really matters, not that nothing matters, they can do anything and we can still be okay while being connected to the now. So why have boundaries? What's the point if I can still be okay in any situation? Aren't boundaries egocentric in the way that they are designed to protect the human from negative experiences? But there are no negative experiences, so see my dilemma. Okay, so there's a lot here. I'm going to say, I think that the first thing, and because again, this is something that I've talked about quite a bit, and I know Andrew's got his thoughts on it as well. The fact is that boundaries aren't necessarily about avoiding a negative experience so much as recognizing that if you don't have the necessary space to be able to process whatever it is you're processing, that you are in fact less useful to yourself or anyone else, right? So you're causing more harm than anything, because you're not in a situation where you actually feel free enough to make the most of each and every moment. So boundaries aren't necessarily about protecting yourself. If you're making a boundary out of reaction to a hurt, that's a toxic boundary. That's going to end up biting you in the ass in the long term. And so boundaries really are about mutual respect, as well as an understanding of the process. And what I mean is that if somebody is self-involved and insecure and they're always leaning on me, I have two choices. I can be of service. If I have no needs or wants in myself, I can be of service. And in some cases, that's a good thing to do. In other cases, that's just enabling, in which case to be of service means to set a boundary. So it's not always in the way that you're currently perceiving it, but the boundaries that are a response to a hurt are egotistical boundaries rather than boundaries of recognition based on awareness and sensitivity. So that's my thought. Now pass it to Andrew.
Well said. Yeah. I think we like to create these ideas of, boundaries and or of anything, and like there being a right side and a wrong side. So with boundaries, we have this perspective like, oh, I shouldn't set boundaries. There's no should. There's no shouldn't. Set boundaries or not set boundaries. It's still something, a response to what's happening. And so there isn't a side that is more spiritual or less spiritual or more accepting or less accepting. It's like, it's always on the fucking table. And how willing you are to pay attention to the situation, how willing you are to let go of your concern for how your value is going to be derived from setting a boundary or not setting a boundary, the more sensitive you're going to be, and your ability to know whether, I should set a boundary here. Maybe you set a boundary that's like super strict and you're like, okay, maybe that was a little far. I've a little more faith in myself. I can pull that back now, but still having the ability to set it, because there's the flip side. If you're concerned, you don't think, you're concerned about what the other person's going to think if you set a boundary. That will hinder you from setting a boundary because of your concern. So it can be on either side. You can make the argument on either side. And so that's the frustrating thing when you're desiring certainty, is there is no right answer. There is no right way. That's why people, they get out of religion, they run to spirituality, because they're like, oh, so there aren't really a right and a wrong. And then spirituality is like, well, actually, there are a few right ways to do things. And, make sure you don't drink too much alcohol, and make sure you do this and careful about that. And XYZ, love everyone all the time, even if it becomes very, very enabling and toxic because we've set these rules and this is the right way. And it's like, no, that's just the discomfort, and you're desiring a cessation of the discomfort. And so people run from religion to spirituality because it gives them another thing to get rid of that rawness of uncertainty, that rawness of the inability to know what's actually best in the moment. It gives you another way to be like, oh, I'm kind of sitting. I don't really know which way to go. And instead of being like, and that's okay, and I'm going to pick this way because why the fuck not? Spirituality is like, no, pick that way because that's better, because that's going to lead to this, because that's going to get you that, and that's going to get you what you want. And that's just another vicious cycle of that, like we were talking about before with the, you're not valuable until you get the thing that you want. And it's not like you can't not have any perception of lack and continue to really, really want things to happen. Like, because you want it to happen, like you're still to a degree maintaining some idea of yourself that wants something that's divided from anything. And so there's still the investment, and that conceptual idea is limited, and therefore it couldn't be whole and complete because it's a limited idea. And then if it's a conceptual idea of being whole and complete, as opposed to what's left when there isn't a conceptual idea, that's where the shift happens. But as long as you're there, you're maintaining your assumptions and judgments and ideas of things, there's no way to ever get to that point. Like, you can want all the things and get all the things, and you're still going to perceive lack to some degree, kind of inevitably.
Yeah, inevitably. Isn't it fun? Like, there really isn't anything you can do to get anywhere that doesn't give you the impression that you're not there. Immediately, like, I need to get somewhere. Where? Well, here now, when I'm there. So it's there now until I'm there. And then it's here now, right? But I got to get there now. And so there's this journey, and immediately you've convinced yourself there is one. This is the problem with coping with things, as we've talked about this before. Like, trying to cope with your anxiety, for example, is building up the idea that you should fear your anxiety. you're actually making your anxiety bigger in terms of your perception of it. And that's why it starts to become overwhelming. It's kind of like your anxiety is a balloon, but every time you look at it and you're just like, Jesus, I don't want to deal with that. It's like you're blowing it up. Right. And so the anxiety is getting bigger. And that's exactly what it is. And you got to let the fucking air out of that shit. And that only means just recognizing that it comes from you. It comes from you, which means that you're more powerful. You were powerful enough to create it. You're powerful enough to keep reinforcing it. So therefore, you're powerful enough to devalue it. You're powerful enough to actually take the entire foundation from underneath it. And the foundation is just based on the idea of yourself, which is that you can't handle it. Worse, the assumption that the anxiety is based on the ideas that you think it's based on. Now you have to avoid those things. Now you got to fix your life. There's all kinds of shit you got to do. Whereas the fact is, you could sit through that feeling until you start to recognize that it's not the danger you think it is. Right. And that's not always going to be easy. I'm talking as somebody who used to black out from anxiety. I had some serious issues. And it was just because I was always tense. The full body clench was a way of life. Right. But it didn't protect me. It made me more vulnerable. And that was the problem. I thought I was protecting myself by trying to avoid the anxiety rather than plowing right through it until I could recognize that it was never the danger I thought it was. And yeah, that required a lot of deep breathing sometimes and a few moments of crying. But the fact is, you get through, and out the other side, you have become something different, or rather you have seen more of your potential, which is very different than trying to convince yourself that you can deal with your anxiety. It's actually just doing it, because then you know it, not as a concept, but in your bones.
It's interesting, even for hypothetical situations. Like I used to, oh man, I was crazy for hypotheticals. I would run through like every potential worst case scenario that could happen, and then what it's going to mean about me, and settling upon all of these assumptions and all of this shit. And with all of those, it's not about getting rid of them. It's like there's a shift in the recognition that if they happened, you'd be fine. Like there's nothing to fear if they happen. It's like, that would be an interesting experience. It honestly probably would be pretty uncomfortable when I was going through it, but it's just something. It still doesn't mean anything about you. It's not like we get caught in thinking, oh, I have to fix my mind. I have to change my mind. I have to have better thoughts. And it's like, no, you just have to shift your perspective of yourself. That's all you got to do, because without so much involvement, investment, idea that, any situation that could play out would mean something about you and would lead to your value being diminished or raised, as long as that isn't there, then you're willing to step into anything. Then you're willing to think any thought. Oh yeah, I could think all the thoughts. I could think all the worst thoughts in the world, all the hypothetical situations that could happen, knowing that I'm not the conceptual idea of myself. There's nothing for it to stick to. And so you're willing to just go through it. So there's a shift in even the perception of the thoughts and your experience of them. It's not a focus on those anymore. It's a focus on what's allowing them to stick. It's a focus on what you think they fucking mean about the assumption of you, about the conceptual idea of you. It's not the thoughts. It's just your perception of yourself and how you think they could mean something, or the situation playing out could mean something about you, or an experience that you have, anxiety, being afraid of anxiety. Like that doesn't mean anything about you. You could have all the anxiety in the world. It doesn't make you less. And so without that, there's more willingness to step into the uncertainty, because yeah, anything could happen and you'd still be there ready to handle it.
See, I love the fact that this is something that you and I had discussed in season 1. And I know this, and I recommend everybody who hasn't checked it out, go and check out season 1, because it's an epic conversation. But what I was saying is that our thoughts aren't necessarily the problem. Our thoughts come from our perception of ourself and reality, right? And so the more divided you see yourself, the more your thoughts must be important. And that's what changes. It's your perception of their role, which is your perception of your role. right? So if you're divided, all of these thoughts that are reinforcing that perception are super important, right? Right? Otherwise, no, they're not. All of a sudden, they become an entirely different thing. They become an entirely different lesson. They become an entirely different experience. It's not that they ever disappear. It's that your reaction, your understanding, the way that you perceive them changes based on how you perceive yourself. What is there to fear in what you are? Are you afraid of yourself? And that's the thing, is everything changes, but it's all based on that perception, which is a spectrum between division and what is. That's all it is. It's just a spectrum, and the spectrum necessitates thought on different levels.
It's funny. I very distinctly remember you saying that. And it's like, I think you get things to varying degrees, and recognizing that, yeah, I need to make an assumption about myself in order for any thought or idea or hypothetical situation to mean anything about me. Because without that, they're just things happening. They're just experiences to be had. But that depth of understanding what it's pointing to is even, I don't know, it just keeps going. And that's just your perspective of yourself, because that's all that's ever shifting is your perspective of yourself, because it's all you and the assumptions that you're settling upon to avoid that discomfort. And so, like, that's it. Like, that's and it's not a journey, because you're not going anywhere. It's just you here now. And like, there's so many assumptions. I've said assumption, I think, like 100 times today, and I'm gonna keep probably doing it. There's so many assumptions. There's so many assumptions about that idea that have built up, and it's not about. I mean, we've said it a number of times. It's not about adding anything to you. It's about peeling back what you think you are, and what's left is the reality of you. Is the reality of what is God experiencing itself, the universe reality, just what is, the rawness of uncertainty of being here now is what's left, without all that fucking armor to hinder you from experiencing the discomfort of the rawness of uncertainty. Like, as that gets peeled away, it's just what's left. But there's so much we build as we grow up and go through that sort of ego development. It's like we're putting on more and more coats of armor. You get to a point that everyone's like lugging around, and they're like, oh, just what I am, just who I am, just the way it is, not willing to question, like, oh, well, maybe that's not me, and like take off that coat of armor. And there's like 20 fucking coats of armor on. Everyone's walking around like with a weight. It's literally, I think it's literally a weight. Like, it is actually a weight. Without that, it is like floating in a
You
sense.
felt it the other day.
Last night. Yeah.
It changes everything. All of a sudden, life isn't oppressive, right? But we invest so much in those layers, in that armor, that we can't feel the sun. We can't hear any of the sound. We can't feel the wind. Like, we're barely aware of each other, because all we can hear is kind of this muffled voice through all the armor. Like, and so we're barely paying attention to what's being said to us, because frankly, it's all going through the filter of everything that we've had to invest in being. Right? I actually call it a filter sometimes, because that's what you're doing when you're talking to someone, is that you're talking to who they think they are, largely. That's what's coming through. That's what's coming through based on how much they're committed to that idea. This is why it's so much easier to talk to people who don't take themselves seriously. There's less filter. They're actually actively listening to you, because they're not trying to get something out of you. Right? But that's it. That's exactly what you're getting through. And that's why it's so important to be sensitive to that. It's so important to recognize when you've done that and where you're still doing that.
Because if they're taking themselves seriously, they're not actually seeing you or interacting with you. They're just waiting to live up to a made up expectation they have of themselves, and waiting to validate that perspective, as opposed to recognizing you for what they are, letting go of what they think they are, which allows them to recognize what you are. But that experience of like feeling everything is like, because there's a point you can almost like feel if you go through and do one of those sort of meditations where you go through and feel your whole body, you can feel it, but then recognizing that's not all you are. Like the more you recognize that you are the environment, you are the situation, you are everything, you start feeling everything. I swear, yesterday I walked past a street sign and it was like that pulling from everything and that, or it was like a compression first and then a pulling simultaneously. So it was like kind of, I don't know, like walking through a jello almost, like where you're just kind of stuck in it. And I swear, like the sign was like a foot or two away, and I could feel it move past in a sense. And it was, again, you could say, oh, that's just your perception of where it was, but is there a difference? Like if I go up and poke it, like I'm still not touching it necessarily. It's just the assumption of what it is and what I am connecting, as opposed to letting go of that and actually feeling yourself walking through yourself.
Well, because what is the idea that you can't feel it other than an assumption? Like, this is the thing, like everything that we feel, we're just like, oh, it's this. How do you know that? Right? Like, and we know, like, you go into a room full of people who are nervous, you can feel what we call the vibe, right? If that's the case, like if we're divided, you're not feeling shit, right? But you are, and you are, and you can feel it in a conversation as well. You can feel the other person as they go up and down if you're paying attention, right? So what's to say that you're not feeling everything else? What's to say that the experience that you're having isn't deeper than you assume it to be, outside of everybody else who's barely aware telling you the same? Right? Like, that's the hardest part about this conversation. It's like, well, why isn't everybody else talking about it? It's like, have you looked around? Have you looked around at what reality is and the shit that we cater to and what we encourage and what we reinforce? Nobody's talking about this because it's fucking hard. That's why nobody's talking about this. That's why everybody's like, well, you're telling me nobody's come up with this before? Yeah, and usually they were burned at the stake before they ever had a chance to talk about it with anyone. So you have to keep that in mind. Just because we've come up with a bunch of good shit doesn't mean that we've understood the all and everything of reality. And to settle on it like, oh, it's either science or religion is the dumbest shit ever. Because if anybody's ever going to figure out what reality is really all about, it's reality, which is you.
Exactly. And we don't want that level of responsibility. But the last thing, kind of along the lines of what we're talking about, I want to say, and I know we have like 1 minute left, but the yesterday when I was looking out, like I was kind of looking over this cliff. I'm in San Diego in Pacific Beach, so there's like kind of a cliff that's like, I don't know, 30 feet off the ground, and that's where I was like feeling that kind of compression and pull. I was looking out at the horizon. The sun had just set, so it was still kind of light out, and it hit me today thinking about that experience, how the term depth perception, it's like, it's a perception of depth. It's not actual depth. And so when I was looking at it, I was seeing like, that's not disconnected from me. And so everything was like at my eyeball in a sense. And there wasn't, I was seeing, it was almost like Truman Show feeling, where that perception of the ocean and the horizon I was overlooking kind of became like a wall. And then it just like kept getting closer. And then everything else I was seeing, like there was no division between me and anything else. Like it was all me experiencing itself, and all the people walking around, the dogs running around, like there wasn't any disconnect from that. I was like, holy fuck, it's just my perception of the disconnect. And it was like, and I was just kind of sitting in it for a while. And that's when I felt like I could have, like, it wouldn't have surprised me if I started like floating away or something. Cause that's like, there wasn't even a weight, like a bodily weight in a sense. It was like all of the compression I feel, because like I have some just tweaks and stuff from running, and like my knees get sore sometimes. There was like an alleviation of all of that. And I was like just feeling everything I was connected to. And there wasn't the like, oh man, because even the experience, the phenomenon of gravity is you also. And so that, like, I don't know. Anyway, it was interesting.
And it continues to get more and more interesting moment after moment after moment. And this is why this conversation is so much fun for me, because up until recently, I've been largely fascinated by this on my own, which is fine because I'm really fascinated by this. So I don't need any of you fuckers. But the fact is that you're here, and I'm really, really enjoying the fact that we can explore all of this together. I can be like, check that out. Oh, watch out for that. You might trip. You know, it's kind of nice. I can't walk it for you, but it's so much fun to watch you walk it yourself. Right, without me ever saying follow me, because that would just fuck it up for you. Right, so I really appreciate the fact that all of you in the community allow me to be a part of your journey. Likewise with Andrew, I appreciate just being here, man. This has been a fantastic episode of Raw. We have come to the end. I'm going to pass it to Andrew, who will wrap it up. Oh, one more thing, actually. It's May. If you would like to save 25% on any of our workshops, you can do so. Use the code yes you may, all one word.
Yes, do that as well. There's a lot of good shit in those workshops. As much as we put out for free, there is a succinctness to the workshops, I would say, that we just like, it's kind of all encompassing of the topic. Whereas, you know, if it social anxiety, for example, like there's a fuckload in that workshop. If you want to, you know, you can also go through all of the episodes and go through that as well if your focus is the social anxiety, because that's going to be a shift in your perspective that'll allow that to be alleviated. But beyond that, if you want the specifics, it's like we got you there as well. So yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I'm gonna keep chewing on shit after this call. It's kind of fun. The shorter Raws, it's like it leaves something to be pondered, as opposed to coming to then and be like, all right, we're done now. It's like, oh man, we could keep going with this, but we're gonna leave some for next time. So I appreciate everyone tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.